She sacrificed her rent money to save a stranger, having no idea that 24 hours later, a billionaire would walk into her diner with a contract that would change everything. Before we dive into the story, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment where in the world you are watching from. The fluorescent lights of the pharmacy buzzed with a low and irritating hum that seemed to vibrate right behind Chloe's eyes, matching the throbbing ache in her tired feet. She had just finished a double shift at the Silver Skillet, and every muscle in her body was screaming for rest, but sleep was a luxury she could not afford yet. She stood in the long line, clutching a crumpled prescription slip for her little brother Toby, whose asthma had worsened with the dropping temperatures. The pharmacy was warm, but the atmosphere was cold. At the front of the line, an elderly woman stood frozen, her small frame trembling inside a coat that was threadbare and completely insufficient for the freezing winter storm raging outside. The pharmacist, a man with a sour expression, tapped his fingers impatiently against the counter. The digital display on the register glowed with a demand of $200. The old woman, whose name was Iris, looked down at her purse with devastation written into the deep lines of her face. She whispered in a voice that cracked with shame that she only had $50. Her hands shook violently as she tried to count the coins again, hoping for a miracle that would not come. Chloe felt a sharp twist in her stomach, a visceral reaction to the despair radiating from the stranger. She slipped her hand into her jeans pocket and fingered the thick roll of cash she had been guarding with her life. It was exactly $250. It was not just paper. It was 2 weeks of humiliation, bad tips, and aching joints. It was their rent money. It was the only thing standing between her and the terrifying unknown. If she gave this up, she and Toby would be defenseless. But as the pharmacist rolled his eyes and told the woman to step aside, Chloe moved. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped past the grumbling customers and slammed the cash onto the counter. Her voice was steady as she told him to ring it up. Iris turned, her eyes wide and watery, looking at Chloe as if she were an angel, but Chloe just forced a smile. Outside, the wind hit them like a physical slap. Chloe walked Iris to the bus stop, the cold biting through her thin uniform. Iris shivered, admitting her grandson had forgotten her again. The admission was so lonely that it hurt to hear. Chloe unraveled her own wool scarf and wrapped it around Iris, ignoring the chill that immediately seized her own neck. She watched the bus drive away, leaving her shivering and effectively bankrupt. The walk back to her apartment felt miles longer than usual. When she finally pushed open the door, the sound of a wet, rattling cough greeted her. Toby was huddled on the sagging couch under a pile of mismatched blankets, his face pale. Guilt crashed over her. She had the medicine, but at what cost? Then her eyes landed on the kitchen table. A bright red paper sat there like a wound. It was an eviction notice. The bold letters demanded payment within 24 hours, or they would be thrown onto the street. The room spun. She had saved a stranger's life, but in doing so she had sacrificed their home. She slid down the wall to the floor, burying her face in her hands as the reality of her choice crushed her chest. She had absolutely no idea that this single desperate moment would change everything for them forever. The morning rush at the Silver Skillet was a chaotic symphony of clattering plates and sizzling bacon that usually comforted Chloe, but today it felt like a countdown timer to her impending doom. Every tip she pocketed was a cruel reminder of the rent money she had sacrificed and the eviction notice waiting on her kitchen table like a loaded gun. She wiped down the sticky counter with a rag that had seen better days, trying to keep her hands from shaking visibly. Suddenly the diner went dead silent. It was the kind of heavy silence that usually meant a health inspector or a robbery was in progress. Chloe looked up and saw a caravan of sleek black SUVs idling at the curb like sharks circling in the water. A chauffeur opened the rear door, and a man stepped out who looked like he had walked straight off the cover of a business magazine. This was Liam Blackwood, though Chloe did not know his name yet. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that probably cost more than the diner made in 6 months, and his polished shoes clicked sharply against the cracked linoleum floor as he entered. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The smell of stale coffee seemed to vanish, replaced by the scent of expensive cologne and raw power. Mr. Miller, the nervous manager, rushed forward, wiping his sweaty hands on his apron to greet the VIP, but the stranger walked right past him as if he were a ghost. His intense gaze was locked on one person and one person only. Chloe froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Had the landlord sent high-end enforcers to throw her out? The man stopped directly in front of her booth, towering over her. Up close, his eyes were a piercing steel gray that seemed to analyze her entire existence in 1 second. He reached into his jacket pocket, and Chloe flinched instinctively, but instead of a weapon or a lawsuit, he pulled out a photograph. He held it up for her to see. It was a picture of Iris, the old woman from the pharmacy. Chloe felt a wave of confusion wash over her as the man asked in a voice that was smooth and commanding if she recognized the woman in the photo. Chloe nodded slowly, admitting she did. The man stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment before revealing that the woman was Iris Blackwood, the founder of Blackwood Systems, and his grandmother. The entire diner gasped. The trembling old woman was actually a billionaire matriarch. Liam pulled a checkbook from his pocket and uncapped a gold pen. He told Chloe that his grandmother had told him what she did. He tore off a check and slid it across the Formica table. It was blank. He told her to write any number she wanted to settle the debt. He expected her to grab it. He expected greed. But Chloe stared at the paper and felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was not excitement, it was insult. She looked at him and saw a man who thought everything had a price tag. She pushed the check back with a trembling hand. She told him firmly that she did not help his grandmother. For a reward, she helped her because she was a human being. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. Liam looked at the rejected check and then at Chloe with a look of genuine shock. He had come here to pay a transaction, but he had just found something money could not buy. Liam Blackwood stepped out of the silver skillet into the biting wind, the rejection of his check burning in his mind like a physical brand. He had expected gratitude, but he had received judgment. His phone vibrated violently in his breast pocket, shattering the moment. He pulled it out to see the name of the chairman of the board flashing on the screen. He answered with a curt greeting, but the voice on the other end was cold and unforgiving. The chairman did not mince words. He told Liam that the vote for his full CEO confirmation was suspended indefinitely. The analytics were in, and the public absolutely hated him. They saw him as a cold, unfeeling robot in a suit, a man with no heart and no family values to anchor him. The board members were terrified that his lack of likability would crash the stock price. The chairman warned him that unless he could prove he was capable of human connection and stability within the quarter, he would be ousted from the company his own family built. Liam clenched his jaw so hard it ached. He looked back through the grease-streaked window of the diner. Inside, Chloe was back at work, wiping down the counter with a weary determination that tugged at something in his chest. She was the exact opposite of him in every way. She was warm, she was struggling, and she possessed a moral compass that money could not sway. She was the missing variable in his equation. An idea formed in his mind, dangerous and desperate. He ended the call and walked back inside. The bell above the door chimed, announcing his return. Chloe looked up, surprise etched on her tired face. She told him firmly that she had meant what she said about the money, and she did not want his charity. Liam slid back into the booth, his demeanor changed. He told her he did not want to give her charity anymore. He wanted to offer her a job. Chloe frowned, asking if he needed a waitress at his corporate office. Liam leaned in his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made Chloe lean in too. He told her he needed a partner, not an employee. He placed his manicured hands on the table and laid out the terms clearly. He needed a fiancée for exactly 3 months to fix his public image and secure his position. In exchange, he would not just pay her overdue rent, he would clear every debt she had paid for her brother Toby's medical bills forever, and buy her a house when the contract ended. Chloe stared at him, the rag falling from her hand. It was an insane proposal, a lie built on a foundation of desperation. Liam looked at her with intense eyes, waiting for her to realize that this was the lifeline she had been praying for. He asked her simply if they had a deal. Chloe stared at the proposal hanging in the air between them like a heavy physical object, her mind reeling from the sheer absurdity of the offer. A fake engagement to a man she did not know in exchange for financial salvation sounded like the plot of a movie she would watch late at night, not something that happened in a diner, smelling of grease and desperation. She opened her mouth to refuse to tell him that her integrity was not for sale, even if her bank account was empty. But before the words could leave her lips, the diner door flew open with a violent crash that made the bell jingle. Painfully, Mr. Henderson, her landlord, marched in with the fury of a storm, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He was a large man who thrived on intimidation, and today he had found his target. He ignored the other customers and zeroed in on Chloe, his face turning a mottled purple with rage as he shouted that her time was up. He slammed his hand on the counter, demanding the rent money right now, or he would drag her things out to the curb himself before the sun went down. The humiliation was instantaneous and suffocating, wrapping around Chloe's throat like a vice. Her co-workers looked down at their shoes, unable to help, and the customers whispered behind their hands. She felt small, powerless, and utterly exposed. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes as she started to stammer an apology, but a shadow fell over Mr. Henderson. Liam Blackwood stood up. He did not shout, he did not even raise his voice. He simply stepped between the landlord and Chloe like a titanium wall. Liam looked at the angry man with an expression of pure boredom mixed with mild disgust, as if he were looking at a stain on his shoe. He asked how much was owed. Mr. Henderson blinked, taken aback by the expensive suit and the aura of command. He stuttered out the amount, trying to regain his bluster. Liam reached into his jacket, pulled out a clip of cash that was thicker than a dictionary, and peeled off several crisp bills. He shoved them into Mr. Henderson's shirt pocket, telling him to keep the change and leave the lady alone. The landlord, suddenly pacified by the greenback, muttered a confused thanks and scurried out the door. The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe looked at Liam, her pride fighting a losing battle against her reality. She realized in that moment that she could not fight the world alone anymore. She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper, as she accepted the deal. 2 hours later, the world had shifted on its axis. Chloe sat in the back of a luxury sedan that smelled of leather and silence, gripping Toby's small hand so tight her knuckles were white. The seats were heated, a comfort she had never experienced, contrasting sharply with the drafty bus rides she was used to. They were driving away from the city, leaving behind the sirens and the grime. Toby was practically vibrating with excitement, his nose pressed against the tinted glass as he pointed out the trees blurring past. Liam sat opposite them, typing on his phone, seemingly unbothered by the fact that he had just bought a family. The car slowed as they approached a set of massive wrought-iron gates that looked heavy enough to keep out an army. The gates swung open silently, revealing a winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees that seemed to stretch on for miles. As the house finally came into view, Chloe stopped breathing. It was not a house, it was a fortress of stone and glass, a sprawling estate that looked like it belonged on a postcard from another century. It was terrifyingly beautiful and aggressively expensive. Toby gasped, shouting that it was a castle just like in his books. Chloe felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was Blackwood Manor, her new prison and her new sanctuary. She looked at the towering structure and felt a wave of imposter syndrome crash over her. She was just a waitress with holes in her sneakers. She had no idea how she was going to survive in this world of giants, nor did she realize that the biggest test was waiting for her just behind those massive oak doors. The grand double doors of the drawing room swung open with a silence that felt heavy and expensive, revealing a space that was larger than Chloe's entire apartment complex. The room was bathed in golden light, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked manicured gardens, but Chloe hardly noticed the view because her eyes were glued to the figure sitting by the roaring fireplace. It was Iris. But this was not the frail, shivering woman from the pharmacy who had looked so small in her threadbare coat. This Iris was draped in emerald silk that shimmered with every breath, and diamonds sparkled at her throat like captured stars. She sat in a velvet armchair with the posture of a queen holding a porcelain teacup with steady hands that showed no sign of the tremors from the day before. Chloe froze in the doorway, her mind struggling to reconcile the two images. Had she been tricked? Was the poverty all a lie? Iris looked up, her sharp eyes locking onto Chloe's confused face. Slowly, a mischievous smile spread across the old woman's lips, and she winked a deliberate conspiratorial wink that shattered the tension instantly. Iris set the cup down and confessed with a chuckle that she often went undercover to test the character of the people her grandson hired, but she had never expected to find a savior in the queue at a pharmacy. She admitted that the frozen bank account was real enough, but only because she had forgotten her PIN number again, not because she was destitute. The relief that washed over Chloe was quickly replaced by a sense of vertigo. She had not just saved a grandmother, she had saved the matriarch of the Blackwood Empire. Iris beckoned Toby, over-offering him a biscuit from a silver tray, immediately cementing herself as an ally in this terrifying new world. But the warmth of the reunion was cut short as Liam checked his watch and announced that the preparation team had arrived. Before Chloe could ask what he meant, a flurry of people swept into the room like a well-dressed hurricane. They were stylists, tailors, and beauty consultants, and they descended on Chloe with measuring tapes and critical eyes. They poked and prodded her, turning her this way and that, muttering about hemlines and color palettes as if she were a mannequin rather than a human being. They held up dresses that looked like they cost more than a car, frowning at her worn sneakers and her messy ponytail. One stylist, a woman with severe glasses, made a snide comment about Chloe's posture, suggesting she needed a corset to fix her slouch. Chloe felt herself shrinking inside. She felt like a doll being dressed up for a game she did not know how to play. The silk and chiffon felt heavy on her skin, suffocating her. She looked at herself in the gilded mirror and did not recognize the person staring back. She looked terrified and fake. Suddenly, a deep voice cut through the chatter. Liam had returned. He stood in the doorway watching the spectacle with a frown that deepened as he saw Chloe's distress. He did not bark orders or cause a scene, he simply walked into the center of the chaos and raised a hand, silencing the room. He looked at the head stylist and told her firmly to leave. The woman sputtered, protesting that the gala was tomorrow, but Liam did not waver. He dismissed them all, clearing the room until it was just him and Chloe amidst a pile of discarded couture. He walked over to a rack of clothes and pushed aside the frilly pastel gowns the stylists had chosen. He pulled out a sleek, structured blazer and a pair of tailored trousers in a deep midnight blue. He held them out to her not as a command but as an offering. He looked her in the eye and told her that she did not need to dress like a debutante to fit in, because she was not there to be a decoration. He told her to wear what made her feel strong, what made her feel like the woman who had stood up to a landlord and saved a stranger. Chloe took the clothes, her fingers brushing against his, and for the first time she saw something in him other than a cold CEO. She saw a man who actually saw her. The countdown to the annual Blackwood Gala had officially begun, and the expansive library of the manor was transformed into a grueling boot camp for high society etiquette. Liam paced back and forth across the Persian rug, holding a silver dinner fork like it was a tactical weapon, while Chloe sat stiffly on a velvet settee, trying desperately to remember the difference between a salad fork and a fish. Knife. The lesson was going terribly. Liam was barking instructions about posture and conversation topics, telling her that she must never discuss politics, religion, or money, which made Chloe laugh nervously, because money was the only thing anyone ever talked about in her world. He quizzed her on the hierarchy of greeting dignitaries, and she failed miserably, mixing up a duke with an earl. She tried to balance a heavy, leather-bound book on her head as he instructed, but it slid off, immediately crashing onto the floor with a loud thud that echoed in the silent room. Liam pinched the bridge of his nose, sighing with a frustration that made Chloe feel small again. He muttered that this was a disaster and that the board would eat her alive if she could not even hold a champagne flute correctly. Chloe stood up, dusting off her knees and feeling a flash of genuine irritation. She told him that she might not know which spoon to use for soup, but she knew how to talk to people, which was more than he seemed to know. Liam ignored her, turning to the antique mirror to adjust his silk tie. His hands were shaking slightly. The knot was crooked, and he yanked at it, cursing under his breath. The cool, composed CEO was cracking under the pressure of his own deception. Chloe watched him for a moment, realizing that he was just as terrified of this charade failing as she was. She stepped forward and gently slapped his hands away. She told him to stop before he strangled himself. She reached up and untied the silk strip, smoothing the fabric over his crisp white collar. The proximity was startling. She could smell the cedar and rain of his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his chest. She looked up into his stormy gray eyes and told him to breathe. She instructed him to relax his shoulders, which were currently touching his ears. She deftly looped the tie, creating a perfect Windsor knot in seconds, a skill she had learned from dressing Toby for school pictures every single year without fail. She patted his chest and told him that he looked fine, and that if he just stopped acting like a robot, people might actually like him. Liam stared at her, the tension draining from his frame, replaced by a stunned silence. He touched the knot, looking at her with a new expression that hovered somewhere between respect and something more dangerous. The moment was broken by the arrival of the car, but the dynamic had shifted. Chloe was no longer the student, she was the anchor. They arrived at the Blackwood Systems headquarters 1 hour later, a glass monolith that pierced the sky. The boardroom was cold and sterile, filled with a long mahogany table and 12 men who looked like they had been carved out of granite. This was the board of directors, and they watched Chloe enter with eyes that were skeptical and cold. Liam introduced her as his fiancée, and the silence that followed was suffocating. One board member, a man named Mr. Sterling with a face like a bulldog, leaned forward and asked sneeringly what a waitress could possibly contribute to the legacy of a tech empire. Liam opened his mouth to defend her, but Chloe spoke first. She did not use big words or corporate jargon. She looked Mr. Sterling in the eye and told him that she served 500 people a week. She told him that she knew exactly what tired parents needed when they walked in the door, and she knew that people did not buy products, they bought feelings. She picked up the sleek new Blackwood phone sitting on the table and told them that to them it was a piece of hardware, but to a mother working 2 jobs, it was the only way to say goodnight to her kids. She told them that if they forgot the people who used their machines, they would lose everything. The room went deadly quiet. Mr. Sterling stared at her for a long, agonizing minute before a slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. He sat back and told Liam that she was the smartest hire he had made in 10 years. The tension broke, and for the first time, Liam smiled a genuine smile that reached his eyes, effectively ending the meeting. The post-meeting celebration was a suffocating whirlwind of champagne toasts and hollow laughter that left Chloe feeling more isolated than ever before. She slipped away from the crowded ballroom and ran across the moonlit lawn toward the only sanctuary she had found on the estate, which was the massive Victorian greenhouse. Inside, the air was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth and sweet-blooming jasmine, a stark and welcome contrast to the sterile air conditioning of the manor. She walked down the rows of exotic ferns, trying to calm her racing heart, when the sound of the heavy glass door opening made her freeze. She expected a security guard, or perhaps a servant, sent to fetch her, but it was Liam. He had abandoned his suit jacket somewhere inside, and his silk tie hung loose around his neck. He did not ask why she ran or demand she return to the party. Instead, he walked silently past her to a small, struggling orchid on a back shelf. He touched the petals with a tenderness that shocked her completely. He confessed in a voice barely above a whisper that he came here every night because it was the only place he could actually breathe. He told her that he never wanted to be a CEO. He hated the boardrooms and the stocks, and the endless pressure. He had wanted to be a botanist to grow things instead of just managing money. He looked at her with a vulnerability that stripped away his power, leaving just a lonely man who felt trapped in a life he did not choose. Chloe felt her chest ache for him, realizing that his golden cage was just as confining as her poverty had been. She stepped closer, telling him that he was good at nurturing things, and that maybe he could do both. For a moment, the air between them crackled with a new kind of electricity, one that had nothing to do with contracts or public image. But the fragile peace was shattered instantly by the sound of tires crunching aggressively on the gravel driveway outside. Liam stiffened his face, closing off like a steel shutter. They hurried out to the driveway just as a sleek red sports car skidded to a halt. The door opened and a man stepped out who looked like a sharper, darker version of Liam. It was Damien, his cousin, and the man who would have been CEO if not for Liam. Damien smiled, but it did not reach his cold eyes. He walked up to them, clapping a hand on Liam's shoulder with a force that looked painful. He congratulated them on the engagement with a sneer that dripped with sarcasm. He turned his predatory gaze to Chloe, looking her up and down as if she were a piece of furniture he intended to return. He leaned in close, smelling of expensive scotch, and whispered that he did not buy their little love story for 1 second. He told Liam that he had already hired the best private investigator in the city to dig into her murky past. He promised them that when he found the dirt, and he was certain there was dirt, he would not just cancel the wedding, he would destroy the company and take the throne for himself immediately. Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. The safety of the greenhouse was gone, replaced by a cold dread. She had no idea that Damien was not just a rival, but a ticking time bomb who was about to blow their entire secret wide open forever. The following afternoon, the bright sun beat down on the meticulously manicured lawns of the city park, but the warmth offered absolutely no comfort to Chloe, who felt exactly like a biological specimen under a high-powered microscope. This was the first official public outing for the so-called happy couple, a calculated strategic maneuver designed by the ruthless public relations team to counter Damien's threats and desperately humanize Liam's robotic image. A dense phalanx of aggressive photographers stood behind the velvet ropes, their telephoto lenses zooming in like the unblinking eyes of mechanical insects hungry for a single slip-up. Liam held Chloe's hand with a grip that was firm but completely devoid of sweat, his handsome face composed into a perfect mask of polite affection. He whispered instructions through his smiling white teeth, telling her to look at him and laugh as if he had just said something incredibly charming. Chloe forced a high-pitched giggle, feeling utterly ridiculous, while Toby ran ahead happily, chasing a bright red plastic kite that danced erratically in the breeze. The camera flashes popped in a blinding staccato rhythm, capturing their staged intimacy for the front page of the morning papers. Suddenly, a sharp and pained cry cut through the ambient noise of the park. Toby had tripped over a large exposed tree root and went sprawling hard onto the rough paved path. The kite fluttered sadly to the ground as the boy grabbed his knee. Chloe moved instinctively to help, but Liam was shockingly faster. He did not hesitate to check his camera angles or worry about the sharp crease in his Italian wool trousers. He broke into a full run, dropping Chloe's hand and skidding violently onto his knees beside the sobbing boy. The paparazzi went wild, sensing a public relations disaster, but what they captured was something entirely different and far more powerful. Liam ignored the cameras completely. He scooped Toby up into his arms, his voice dropping to a soothing, low murmur that Chloe had never heard before. He pulled a pristine white silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, a square of fabric that likely cost more than Chloe's entire monthly grocery budget, and pressed it gently against Toby's bloody knee, ruining it instantly without a second thought. He wiped the hot tears from Toby's face and made a silly joke about fighting gravity, which made the boy hiccup a wet laugh. Chloe watched from a few feet away, her heart doing a strange and dangerous flip in her chest. For the first time, she did not see a billionaire protecting his assets, she saw a father protecting a child. The spark was undeniable, and it was terrifying. Later that night, the massive manor was wrapped in a heavy silence that felt amplified by the earlier chaos of the day. They sat in the dim library, the only light coming from the green banker's lamp on the heavy mahogany desk. Between them lay the contract, a thick stack of legal papers that strictly defined the boundaries of their arrangement. They were supposed to be reviewing the clauses regarding asset separation in case Damien attacked, but the words blurred on the page. Liam rubbed his temples, looking exhausted and incredibly human. He muttered that he never had anyone to patch his knees when he was a boy because his parents were always at galas just like the one they were preparing for. Chloe looked up, surprised by the sudden admission. She told him quietly about her own childhood, how she had to learn to be the parent when her mother left. The conversation flowed naturally away from legalese into the dangerous territory of shared scars. They realized they were both lonely children hiding in adult bodies. Liam looked across the desk, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that burned. He leaned in, slowly drawn by a magnetic force that defied the legal text. Chloe held her breath, her lips parting slightly. The air crackled with unspoken desire. They were inches away, the paper barrier forgotten. Then reality crashed back in. Liam pulled back abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wood floor. He cleared his throat, turning his face away, and muttered that they should stick to the agreement. The moment shattered, leaving a heavy, unresolved tension hanging in the room like smoke. The annual Blackwood Charity Gala was the apex of the social calendar, a dazzling spectacle held in the grand ballroom, where the city's elite gathered under the brilliance of 3 massive crystal chandeliers that shimmered with a blinding intensity. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low murmur of judgmental gossip that stopped abruptly the moment Chloe appeared at the top of the sweeping marble staircase. She was wearing a gown of deep crimson silk, a striking and bold choice that Liam had insisted upon, claiming it was the color of power, not submission. The fabric cascaded around her frame like liquid fire, and for a fleeting second she felt the intoxicating rush of the Cinderella fantasy she had read about to Toby. Liam stood at the base of the stairs, his glass of vintage champagne forgotten in his hand as he watched her descend. His grey eyes, which were usually so guarded, were wide with a raw, undisguised hunger that made Chloe's heart hammer violently against her ribs. She reached the bottom, and he took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a way that felt dangerously possessive. But the fairy tale was shattered the moment they stepped into the crushing crowd. Damian Blackwood emerged from the shadows of a heavy velvet curtain, blocking their path with the predatory grace of a wolf who had finally cornered its prey. He separated them deftly, guiding Chloe toward a secluded alcove with a grip on her elbow that was bruising. His charm had evaporated, leaving only cold malice. He held up a thin manila folder, tapping it against his palm with a rhythmic menace. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of scotch, and whispered that the game was officially over. He told her that inside the folder were copies of her eviction notices, her credit card statements, and a detailed history of every double shift she had worked at the Silver Skillet for minimum wage. He gave her a choice that was not really a choice at all. He told her she could leave right now quietly through the servants' entrance and never come back, or he would walk up to the microphone in exactly 5 minutes and announce to the entire room that the future matriarch of Blackwood Systems was nothing but a destitute waitress drowning in debt. The shame hit Chloe like a physical blow. The crimson dress suddenly felt like a cheap costume, and she felt small and dirty amidst the diamonds. She looked at Damian's triumphant sneer and prepared to run to accept her defeat and protect Liam from the scandal. She turned to flee but collided with a solid wall of tuxedo fabric. It was Liam. He had not stayed behind. He had followed them. Damian laughed, holding up the folder like a trophy, telling Liam to cut his losses before the stock price tanked. Liam looked at the folder and then at Chloe's terrified face. He took the folder from Damian's hand and, without breaking eye contact, tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper was shocking in the tense silence. Damian sputtered in disbelief, but Liam turned his back on him, pulling Chloe into the center of the room. He raised a hand, silencing the orchestra and the hundreds of guests. He spoke with a voice that shook the walls, not with anger but with conviction. He told the room that there were rumors about where his fiancée came from. He admitted to everyone that she did not come from money. The crowd gasped, scandalized. Liam tightened his grip on her hand. He continued, saying that she had worked harder for her survival than anyone in that room had worked for their fortunes. He declared that she had paid for a stranger's life with her own rent money, and that she possessed a nobility that could not be bought. He looked at Chloe and announced that he did not choose her to hide her past. He chose her because her past made her stronger than him. He dropped the pretense and leaned in. He kissed her. It was not a stage kiss for the cameras. It was fierce, consuming, and terrifyingly real, blurring the lines of the contract until they vanished completely, leaving the audience stunned. The morning sun that flooded the master suite of Blackwood Manor felt cruel in its cheerfulness, mocking the absolute devastation that was about to unfold. Chloe woke up, wrapped in high thread-count sheets, feeling a lingering warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the central heating and everything to do with the kiss Liam had given her on the gala stage the night before. For the first time in her difficult life, she allowed herself to believe that the fairy tale might actually be real, and that the contract stored in the wall safe was just a formality that no longer mattered. She sat up, stretching her arms and smiling at the dust motes dancing in the light, but her smile died instantly when she saw Liam. He was standing across the room, facing the large oil painting that concealed the hidden safe, and his posture was rigid with a tension that screamed danger. He was not the romantic hero from the ballroom anymore, he was a statue of cold panic. Chloe called his name softly, but he did not turn around. He simply stared into the dark hollow of the open safe. The heavy steel door was ajar. Inside, the velvet-lined shelf, where the thick legal document had rested, was completely empty. The contract, the physical proof of their deception, the paper that explicitly detailed the transaction of cash for affection was gone. Liam turned slowly, and his face was a mask of gray ash. He whispered that the safe had not been forced open, which meant someone with the combination had opened it. His eyes flickered to Chloe for a fraction of a second, a microscopic movement of doubt that hit her like a physical slap. Before she could defend herself or ask what he meant, the silence of the morning was shattered by a sound that would haunt her for years. It started as a single vibration on the nightstand, then another, then a cascade of digital noise that sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. Every phone, tablet, and screen in the room lit up simultaneously. Liam grabbed his phone, his knuckles turning white as he read the notification that had just been pushed to millions of screens across the city. The headline was not just a leak, it was an assassination. It read in bold black letters, "Waitress hired as fake fiancé, the billionaire's $10 million lie." Chloe felt the air leave her lungs. It was not just a rumor, it was the truth, stripped of all its nuance and presented as a dirty con. The article detailed everything, including the debt payoff, the house promise, and her brother's medical bills, painting her as a manipulative gold digger who had preyed on a lonely heir. Suddenly, a low roar began to rise from outside the estate walls, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Chloe ran to the window and looked down at the main gates. What had been a quiet country lane was now a chaotic sea of news, vans, satellite trucks, and screaming reporters. They were pressing against the iron bars like zombies trying to breach a fortress, their cameras pointed up at the bedroom window, hungry for a glimpse of the fraud. The sanctuary of the manor had been breached. The world knew their secret, and the narrative had been spun so viciously that there was no coming back from it. Chloe backed away from the window, her hands trembling violently. She looked at Liam, hoping for the protector who had stood up for her at the gala, but he was staring at his plummeting stock ticker on the television screen. The isolation was instant and suffocating. The public loved a Cinderella story, but they loved tearing a fake princess apart even more, and the dismantling of her life had just begun. The bedroom, which had felt like a sanctuary only moments ago, had transformed into a cold war room of silent accusations and suffocating panic. Liam Blackwood paced the hardwood floor with the frenetic energy of a caged animal, his eyes darting between the empty safe and the tablet screen where the Blackwood system's stock graph was nosediving into absolute oblivion. The air was thick with the ringing of unanswered phones. Chloe stood by the window, her heart fracturing in her chest, as she watched the man she loved crumble under the crushing weight of his legacy. She reached out a hand to comfort him, but he flinched away as if her touch burned. He spun around, his gray eyes, wild and darkened by a paranoia she had never seen before. He asked her the question that would shatter them completely. He asked if she had left the safe unlocked. It was not a scream, but a hoarse whisper which made it infinitely worse. Chloe froze, feeling the blood drain from her face. She asked him if he really thought she was capable of betraying him for a payout. Liam ran a hand through his hair, looking trapped. He muttered that only 2 people knew the combination, and he knew he had not left it open. The implication hung in the air between them like a sharp guillotine blade. He did not say she stole it, but he did not say he trusted her either. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. In that silence, Chloe realized that the last 3 months meant nothing. To him, she was still just a waitress who needed money. She did not argue or cry or try to defend her honor. She simply walked to the closet and pulled out her battered duffel bag. She ignored the rows of silk gowns and designer shoes, grabbing only her worn jeans and her faded uniform. She placed the massive diamond engagement ring on the mahogany nightstand where it landed with a final hollow click. She walked out of the room past the weeping servants and through the back exit, leaving the billionaire alone with his suspicions. 24 hours later, the world had returned to a cruel and dull shade of gray. The silver skillet diner was louder than Chloe remembered, a cacophony of clattering plates and shouting cooks that drilled into her skull. She was back in her stained apron, scrubbing a sticky patch of syrup off table 4 with a rag that smelled of bleach and despair. The contrast was physically painful. Her hands, which had held crystal champagne flutes just 2 nights ago, were now red and chapped from the harsh industrial soap. But the physical labor was nothing compared to the emotional torture. Every customer who walked in seemed to be holding a newspaper with her face plastered on the front page. She could feel their eyes boring into her back, whispering the lies they had read about the gold digger who got caught. She kept her head down, scrubbing harder until her knuckles turned white, trying to erase the stain of the scandal. Mr. Miller barked an order from the kitchen, telling her to pick up the pace because table 6 was waiting. Chloe moved robotically, pouring coffee and forcing a smile that felt like it was cracking her face. She realized with a crushing clarity that she was not miserable because she had lost the mansion or the wealth. She was miserable because every time the door chimed, she looked up, hoping to see a man in a charcoal suit who was never coming back. She had returned to her old life, but she no longer fit inside it because her heart was still trapped in a lie that had felt more real than anything else. She was completely alone, surrounded by noise, a fallen Cinderella scrubbing floors with no glass slipper left to find, and the crushing weight of her reality was heavier than any tray she had ever carried in her entire life. The violent vibration of the cheap, cracked cell phone buzzing against Chloe's hip was the only thing that could pierce the heavy and suffocating numb fog that had settled over her since she had walked out of the iron gates of Blackwood. Manna. She almost ignored the call, thinking it was likely another vulture from the tabloids trying to fish for a quote to further destroy her life. But the screen flashed with the one name she had promised herself she would never answer again, which was Liam. She picked it up, intending to hang up and sever the connection forever, but the sound of his ragged breathing stopped her cold. He was not the imperious CEO commanding a boardroom, nor was he the angry accuser who had broken her heart. He was simply a terrified grandson watching his entire world end. He choked out the devastating words that Iris had collapsed. The relentless stress of the scandal and the vicious media attacks had been too much for her frail heart to bear, and she was currently in critical condition at the city hospital, asking for the presence of only one person, and it was not. Chewing. Chloe dropped her serving tray immediately. The sound of shattering ceramic and dark splashing coffee echoed through the silent diner, but she was already running out the door, tearing off her stained apron as she sprinted toward the bus stop, her righteous anger evaporating instantly. In the face of genuine tragedy, she arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later, breathless and terrified, her worn sneakers squeaking loudly against the cold, pristine white floors of the intensive care unit waiting room. The atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, filled with the sharp chemical scent of antiseptic and the heavy weight of impending death. Liam was sitting on a plastic chair, with his head buried in his hands, a portrait of absolute and crushing defeat, but he was not alone in the corridor. Damian Blackwood was leaning against the sterile wall, looking for all the world like a predator waiting for a large, fresh carcass to cool. He checked his heavy gold watch with an air of bored impatience that made Chloe's blood boil in her veins. When he saw her approach, his lip curled into a sneer of pure, malicious triumph. He stepped directly into her path, blocking her access to the family room, and whispered venomously that she had some nerve showing her face here after destroying the family reputation with her greed. He told her to go back to her diner because the check was cancelled. The old woman was dying, and the game was officially over. Chloe looked at him, and for the first time she did not feel intimidated. She felt a cold and dangerous clarity. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her cracked phone, not to call for help, but to press play on a voice memo she had recorded days ago during the gala, when she had overheard a hushed conversation in the service corridor. The audio was grainy, but the voices were unmistakable to everyone present. It was Damien's voice, clear as a bell, offering the head of security $50,000 to leave the master suite safe unlocked for just 5 minutes. The room went deadly silent as the recording played on. Mr. Sterling, the board member who had grilled her weeks ago, stood up from the corner, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the upholstery. Damien paled his arrogance, crumbling into dust as the recording continued, detailing exactly how he planned to leak the contract, to destroy the stock price and seize control for himself. Chloe did not ask for a reward or a reinstatement. She simply walked over to Mr. Sterling and placed the phone in his hand, telling him calmly that this was the truth they needed to save the company. She looked at Liam, who was staring at her with a mixture of horror and awe, realizing too late that she had been the only honest thing in his life. She turned around and walked away from the billionaire and the board, leaving the evidence of her virtue behind without asking for a single dime in return, proving once and for all that her integrity was the one and only thing they could never afford to buy. The silence in the sterile hospital corridor was absolute and heavy, following the chaotic removal of Damien by the hospital security team, leaving only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead to fill the void. Mr. Sterling stood holding the cracked phone that contained the damning evidence of the conspiracy, looking at Liam with a mixture of calculated relief and corporate expectation. He smoothed his silk tie and cleared his throat, announcing that with the threat of Damien eliminated, the board was prepared to reinstate Liam immediately as the undisputed CEO of Blackwood Systems. He added quickly that there was just one small condition, which was that Liam must issue a formal statement distancing himself from the scandal and the waitress to calm the jittery shareholders. It was the moment Liam had worked his entire life to achieve the ultimate validation of his competence and the security of his legacy. He looked at the board members standing in a semicircle, these powerful men in gray suits who viewed human beings as liabilities on a spreadsheet, and then he looked down at his own hands, which were still trembling from the terror of almost losing Iris. He realized with a sudden and violent clarity that the golden throne he had fought so hard to secure was actually just a cage. He looked Mr. Sterling in the eye and spoke with a voice that was quiet but shattered the stagnant air like a gunshot. He told them that he did not want the job if it meant becoming a man who traded loyalty for stock points. He told them that the waitress they despised had more integrity in her little finger than the entire board had in their collective bank accounts. He reached up and unpinned his security badge, letting it drop to the sterile floor with a final plastic clatter that echoed like a judgment. He declared that if the company could not value the truth, then he would build something else that did. He turned his back on the billion-dollar empire and walked out of the automatic doors into the cold night air, feeling lighter than he had in 10 years. 2 hours later, the chaotic lunch rush at the Silver Skillet was finally winding down, leaving the diner smelling of burnt coffee and stale fryer grease. Chloe was wiping down table 4, moving with the mechanical exhaustion of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The bell above the door chimed softly, signaling a new arrival. She did not look up immediately, muttering that the kitchen was closing in 10 minutes. When no answer came, she raised her eyes and froze. Liam was standing in the entryway, but he looked like a complete stranger. The bespoke Italian suit was gone, replaced by a pair of worn denim jeans and a simple grey sweater that looked soft and lived in. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear and free of the guarded steeliness that had defined him for so long. He walked over to her booth, not with the commanding stride of a CEO, but with the hesitation of a man asking for a second chance. He did not pull out a checkbook or a thick legal binder. He sat down opposite her and picked up a flimsy paper napkin from the dispenser. He took a pen from his pocket and wrote 3 words on the textured paper before sliding it across the scratched formica table. Chloe looked down, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. It was not a prenup or a non-disclosure agreement. In shaky handwriting it read simply, "Partner for life." Liam whispered that he had resigned from the board because a kingdom was not worth anything if he had to rule it alone. He told her that he did not have a mansion to offer her anymore, just himself and a lot of baggage, but he promised that this time the contract was real. Chloe looked at the napkin and then at the man who had given up everything for her. She realized that the fairy tale was not about the castle, it was about the choice. She looked at his waiting hand and felt the last wall around her heart crumble into dust. She picked up the pen and signed her name. The snow began to fall softly outside the frosted windows of the Silver Skillet, painting the gritty city streets in a layer of pristine white that looked like powdered sugar, but inside the air was warm and thick with the scent of vanilla. And frying bacon. The corner booth that had once been the site of a desperate business transaction was now overflowing with noise, and life crowded in the absolute best possible way. Toby was squeezed tightly between Liam and the window, diligently building a fortress out of crispy French fries and ketchup packets, while narrating an epic battle between potato soldiers. Liam Blackwood, who had once looked like he was allergic to grease and fun, was currently laughing so hard that he nearly choked on his strawberry milkshake. He was wearing a soft flannel shirt that Chloe had bought him from a local thrift store, and for the first time in his 30 years on Earth, he looked like he actually belonged in his own skin. Across the table, Iris sat with a vitality that completely defied her medical chart. She was stealing onion rings from Chloe's plate with a mischievous wink that reminded everyone exactly who ran the family. She looked healthy and vibrant, her heart strong not because of expensive treatments but because it was finally full. Chloe looked around the table, feeling a lump form in her throat that had nothing to do with sadness. The eviction notices were gone forever, replaced by the deed to a small fixer-upper house with a big yard for Toby. The bank accounts were not overflowing with billions anymore, but they were stable. However, looking at the faces around her, Chloe realized that the numbers did not matter. She watched Liam wipe a smudge of ketchup off Toby's cheek with a tenderness that made her chest ache. He caught her staring and smiled a genuine crinkle-eyed smile that reached all the way to his soul. He reached under the table and squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band. In the center of the table, framed in a cheap plastic holder, was the paper napkin that said, "Partner for life." There were no cameras here to capture this. There were no press releases or stock tickers or board members judging their worth. There was just the sound of family laughter and the warmth of bodies pressed close together against the winter chill. The narrative had come full circle, starting with a sacrifice of rent money for a stranger and ending with the realization that kindness was the only currency that ever truly appreciated in value. Chloe took a bite of her burger, savoring the taste of absolute freedom. She looked out at the falling snow, which no longer felt dangerous or cold. It just looked beautiful. They were safe. They were together. As Toby knocked down his fry castle with a squeal of delight, Chloe knew with certainty that this chaotic, messy, loud table was the wealthiest place on the entire planet. If Chloe's journey reminded you that true wealth isn't found in a bank account, but in the people sitting at your table, please hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction is the fuel that keeps these stories alive. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to experience our next emotional roller coaster. And finally, share this video with someone who feels invisible or underappreciated today. Remind them that their kindness is seen, their integrity matters, and their miracle might be just around the corner. Thank you for watching.